Hello and thank you for joining us this evening on the Capitol Report. I'm your host, Steve Lance. Here's a look at some of the stories we're covering for you today. The Biden administration's vaccine rules for the private sector will take effect on January 4th. Those who do not comply with the mandate will get a $14,000 fine per each violation. Attorneys general from 26 states across the country have already filed lawsuits against what they're calling illegal and unconstitutional vaccine mandates. President Biden has just given direction on how he plans to enforce the vaccine mandate on the private sector. Our next guest is a prominent civil rights attorney in New York City, Brooke Goldstein. We speak with her to break it all down. And we speak to Montana Congressman Matt Rosendale about new legislation he introduced to properly vet immigrants from foreign countries who may pose a threat to the United States. He also weighs in on the elections this week, which have many wondering what this means for the Democrats' future agenda. The Biden administration has just announced the vaccine rules for large employers, federal contractors, and certain healthcare workers. The new rules will take effect on January 4th. Workers at companies with over 100 employees need to be fully vaccinated or be tested weekly starting on January 4th. The action was taken under the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA's, emergency authority. It applies to 84 million workers at 2 million private sector companies. OSHA estimates that almost 40% of covered workers are unvaccinated. That's roughly 30 million people. Employers are not required to provide or pay for tests, and the rule is supposed to offer medical and religious exemptions. Unvaccinated people must wear masks at work. Industry groups such as retailers, builders, and auto workers are voicing their concerns. The announcement also makes clear that the vaccine rules will preempt any state or local laws. Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmitt took quick legal action after the Biden administration unveiled the new federal vaccination rule. Schmitt, along with more than 24 states, filed lawsuits Friday to halt what they call an illegal, unconstitutional action. And a group of Republicans are planning to introduce a resolution to strike down this new mandate. Congresswoman Virginia Foxx said in a statement Thursday that GOP lawmakers on the House Education and Labor Committee will immediately introduce a Congressional Review Act resolution to, quote, nullify OSHA's emergency rule when it is received by Congress. And on Wednesday, a group of Republican senators sent a letter to the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer signaling their intention to block funding for the vaccine mandate. With President Biden's vaccine mandate set to affect private sector businesses with his new rule that does not appear to be an actual law, we had a chance to speak with New York City-based civil rights attorney Brooke Goldstein to get more perspective. Brooke Goldstein, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Brooke, President Biden has just announced guidance, if you will, on the private sector and how they'll have to comply with his latest rule, because I'm not sure we can even call it a law at this point, which is my question to you. Is this a rule or a law, and how will it be enforced?
So I think the real question is this even constitutional? What this is the executive branch, in my opinion, exercising extreme broad overreach, using the OSHA mandate to justify that, which is an administrative body within the executive, and to make a rule that has the potential to affect 84 million U.S. workers, over 50% of the U.S. workforce, in an area of health and wellness that is normally a state power. And so I think we all have to step back and ask ourselves, does the existence and spread of the coronavirus, and God forbid any future virus, justify such extreme executive overreach? What we're talking about is a mandate that on its face is, I have to say, draconian and arbitrary. Okay, it doesn't take into account nuances like me. I have one vaccine. I'm also recovered. My doctor has advised that I don't need to take any more vaccines right now. Where do we fall? There is no nuance. It is forcing people to wear a mask at work and get tested. Well, what's the point of getting tested every week if you're also going to wear a mask? We have to think very long and hard before we start justifying this type of arbitrary laws.
Now, is there any precedent for this type of situation that we've seen with all of these mandates in terms of legal standing for what we've been seeing unfolding throughout the country?
No, I don't think there's any precedent to this situation as a whole, where worldwide we're witnessing, I think, insanity in terms of governments using the spread of a virus to justify the abrogation of our basic civil rights. And we have to think in the future. I mean, law is all about precedent, and we value our Constitution because it establishes certain rights and obligations and restrictions on government. Citizens have a basic right to assemble. We have a basic right in America to life and liberty and to make a living. The government should not have the right to force you to take a vaccine under the threat of losing your job. Let's say 1 out of 5 workers refuse to comply, maybe with the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th vaccine down the line. And again, we don't know how long this mandate is going to last. What is the time limit? That 1/5 of 84 million, 16 million workers might potentially lose their job. Is this good policy? What it also does is it creates a situation where the states have to choose to either comply with what I think is a constitutionally questionable mandate, or potentially violate contracts, labor contracts, and come into conflict with labor unions. You're putting the state in a position of uncertainty, and this is the type of volatility that we don't need in this time. So again, COVID does not excuse government overreach. It doesn't mean that we should put a pause on talking about our basic civil rights to gather and interact with each other and do business without being covered constantly. So we need to be talking about these things openly.
Brooke Goldstein, thank you.
Thank you.
President Biden is disputing claims that the government would compensate illegal border crossers who have been separated from their children. The Wall Street Journal first reported that the government was considering payments around $450,000 to each person who had been affected. On November 4th, Republican Congressman Tom McClintock introduced a bill to prevent the Attorney General from making compromise settlement payments to any party breaking immigration laws. McClintock said such payments would be a business boom for drug cartels and human traffickers. We had a chance to speak with Congressman Matt Rosendale about a recent bill he introduced to counter the flow of unvetted refugees into the United States. He also weighs in on the election results from earlier this week. Here's a look. Congressman Matt Rosendale, thank you for joining us on the Capitol Report.
Good to be here with you today, Steve.
Now, Congressman, you introduced the Secure America Act. This is in response to the unvetted Afghan refugees coming into the country. How big of a deal was this, and what exactly is your bill aiming to do?
So we could see that there was going to be a problem as soon as they started having discussions about the accelerated withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I came out publicly at that time and said, let's not use this as an excuse to bring hundreds of thousands of refugees out of Afghanistan and drop them in the United States. And sure enough, no sooner did the withdrawal begin, that's exactly what happened. And what we saw were a lot of folks that were granted parolee status, which means they have zero vetting whatsoever, and they were airlifted out of Afghanistan, many of them, tens of thousands, brought here to military bases in the United States. And at that time, I sat down with my staff, and what we did was draft language to regain control over this situation. So the Secure America Act has several key components. Number one, it has Congress reclaim authority to how many refugees will even come into our country on any given year. The next thing it does is gives the governors for each of the respective states the final say if they're going to be located in their state. It directs Homeland Security and the FBI to create a good, new, thorough vetting system, and it strips from the executive the ability to even grant this parolee status, which then brings refugees in that haven't been vetted and gives them the ability to travel freely around our country.
Now, Congressman, have there been any red flags since they've been flying these unvetted refugees into the country from the intelligence community?
There's been red flags, there's been crimes that have been committed. So the exact same things that we were concerned that were going to take place place have already taken place. We've seen in Fort Shaw, Fort McCoy, both of these places have had these refugees commit crimes, violent crimes against other people that are there on the bases. One, we had a service officer who actually had 5 refugees attack her. That is a problem. And then, most recently, in Missoula, Montana, we only had 10 refugees actually had landed there, and out of the 10, one of them is already charged with raping a young woman.
Now, President Biden, switching topics a little bit here, has just released a directive of sorts requiring businesses with 100, private businesses with employees of 100 or more to start to mandate the vaccines. Where do you see this going?
I see we're seeing pushback all across the country on this, and I also recognize that he sees that there's probably going to be legal challenges to those issues, and so that's why we have not seen, what we haven't seen are rules being delivered and proposed from OSHA, from labor, yet to really even implement that edict. Because they recognize that once they release those rules, that we're going to have lawsuits, whether it's from the private businesses or from the state's attorney general, that are going to push back and try to keep this from being implemented. So what they're doing now is what we see time and time again take place through the Biden administration, and that is to use political power to force the businesses that are willing to do so to carry his water, basically, and enforce those mandates on their own employees. But we're also seeing that there's employees that are just flat walking off of the job.
Now, Congressman, lastly, I want to ask you about the elections that took place earlier in the week. There were sweeping wins, specifically in Virginia, where Republicans won decisively in 3 major statewide elections that typically have been trending blue over the years. Is this a window, from your perspective, into the 2022 midterms?
Oh, I absolutely believe that it is. I would like to take some of the credit as I went down to Liberty College and spoke to a group of grassroots supporters about 2 months ago and let them know that there is hope. That 10 years ago, Montana had 7 of its 8 statewide elected officials were Democrats, and now it's 7 of the 8 are Republicans. So if they put up good candidates and they work hard, that they can turn this around, and they sure enough did so.
Congressman Rosendale, thank you.
Thank you.
Inflation lingers at a 30-year high, partly caused by the supply chain bottleneck. When will the congestion and inflation woes settle? And how is the administration working on solving the truck driver shortage across the country? Senator Rand Paul grilled Dr. Anthony Fauci at a hearing, accusing him of misleading the public by changing the definition of gain of function. He also called on him to resign. And the pandemic hasn't stopped Beijing's military expansion. A new Pentagon report shows the regime intends to have at least 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. Far more than previously estimated. Inflation lingers at a 30-year high, partly caused by the supply chain holdup. The Biden administration is working on solutions, but won't give any estimates as to when the bottlenecks will ease up and inflation will go down. NTD's Melina Wisecup joins us to discuss. So, Melina, how is the administration tackling this congestion, and is it expected to ease up anytime soon?
Steve, it doesn't look like the administration has any specific time frame on when the supply chain will return back to normal. We heard from the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo, this week, and she was asked specifically about this time frame, when she expects the congestion to go down, and she had no answer. Now, as for inflation, the Federal Reserve Chairman said that he expects it to cool off by summer.
Our tools cannot ease supply constraints. Like most forecasters, we continue to believe that our dynamic economy will adjust to the supply and demand imbalances, and that as it does, inflation will decline to levels much closer to our 2% longer-run goal.
Now, some economists do acknowledge that the supply chain congestion isn't the sole reason for the inflation that we're seeing. It's also caused by injecting more money into the economy like we saw over the course of the pandemic. But the supply chain does have some effect. And we know that the Biden administration, to help solve some of these issues, is working with the private sector to move freight more efficiently. We know that California ports are operating right now at 24 hours a day. But it's unclear how long those extended hours of operation will have to go on before things go back to normal. Steve?
And Melina, we know that another factor causing the supply chain crisis is the truck driver shortage. Right now, there is a shortage of around 80,000 truck drivers. Congressman David Scott, who chairs the House Agriculture Committee, said this week that the truck driver shortage could cause issues in the food supply chain as well. So, Melina, is the administration working on tackling this pressing issue?
Well, Secretary Raimondo is working with the Transportation Secretary to make it easier for younger people to get their CDL licenses and drive across state lines. There is huge need for truck drivers in the industry right now. Some companies are even willing to double the salary or offer thousands of dollars in sign-on bonuses in order to attract new drivers. But some officials are concerned that Biden's vaccine and testing mandates could actually make this truck driver shortage even worse. When this takes effect on January 4th, it could lead to larger trucking companies losing drivers. That's what we heard from the executive director of the American Trucking Association. He told Congress that he's concerned about this. Steve?
And Democrats have really been using the supply chain jam to highlight the need for the House to pass the infrastructure bill, saying that it would improve the waterway systems and help the supply chain to run more efficiently. This bill already passed the Senate months ago, but is stalled in the House. Melina, any word on progress here?
Steve, the House has been in limbo about these two bills for weeks. And like you mentioned, upon passing the House, it will go straight to Biden's desk for signing since it already did pass the Senate. Now, this one would include that funding for the bridges, roads, waterways, hard infrastructure. There is some broadband funding in there. There's also some funding for the electric vehicles and charging stations. And Pelosi's been trying to hold this vote for weeks, and over again, she's had to postpone it time and time again. Now, we know that the progressive side of it is they want to pass that social welfare and climate spending bill first. So Pelosi did try to rush that Build Back Better bill today so that she could get that smaller, hard infrastructure bill passed, but she faced some backlash from the moderates who really wanted to see the Congressional Budget Office report first so that they could see the overall cost and how much it would impact the national debt. Now, as for that Build Back Better plan becoming official, even upon passing the House, its fate is still questionable in the Senate. Steve?
Melina Wisecup reporting. And Senate Democrats this week offered some solutions to prevent this supply chain chaos from happening in the future. Senator Ron Wyden says strengthening the alliance to isolate China is part of the solution.
We are going to find a way to get much needed, high quality steel and aluminum inputs for our companies and our workers because we want more American workers.
We announced a historic trade deal with the Europeans to lift the tariffs on steel and aluminum. That goes into effect January 1st.
This new trade deal with Europe is expected to reduce costs for steel and aluminum, creating more American jobs. During a Senate committee hearing on the COVID-19 response, Senator Rand Paul grilled Dr. Anthony Fauci over the NIH's funding to support gain-of-function research at China's Wuhan lab. He also called on Fauci to resign.
Until you accept it, until you accept responsibility, we're not going to get anywhere close to trying to prevent another lab leak of this dangerous sort of experiment. You won't admit that it's dangerous, and for that lack of judgment, I think it's time that you resign.
During the hearing on Thursday, Senator Rand Paul blasted Dr. Fauci for his repeated denial that the NIH funded the gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab.
Your persistent denials, though, are not simply a stain on your reputation, but are a clear and present danger to the country and to the world.
Paul went on to accuse Fauci and the NIH of saying it doesn't exist by changing the definition of gain of function on the NIH's website.
I disagree with so many of the things that you've said. First of all, gain of function is a very nebulous term.
Fauci argues that the current definition was established over the course of 2 to 3 years by some outside bodies. He also said that COVID-19 was much more likely to be a natural occurrence. This hearing comes 2 weeks after the NIH admitted to funding gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan lab, though Fauci keeps on denying that to Congress. Senator Paul told NTD's Bo Davidson, host of The Bo Show, that the most important thing is what we do moving forward.
Should we be doing gain-of-function research? Should the taxpayer be funding it? Do we trust the Chinese to be doing this in a fashion that it wouldn't leak from a lab, or they might not try to militarize it? These are all important questions, and nobody's asking them. We've had no committee hearings on this.
And Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti has tested positive for COVID-19 on Wednesday while attending the UN Climate Conference in Glasgow, Scotland. The event has drawn world leaders and tens of thousands of others from around the world. Mayor Garcetti's office announced a positive test result in a tweet, adding only he is, quote, feeling good and is isolating in his hotel room, and that he is fully vaccinated. According to an annual report released by the Pentagon on Wednesday, the Chinese regime is rapidly expanding its strategic missiles. The CCP intends to deploy up to 1,000 warheads by 2030, nearly 4 times previous estimates. The new report said that the accelerating pace of Chinese nuclear expansion may enable the regime to have up to 700 deliverable nuclear warheads within 5 years. It also alleges that the CCP intends to have at least 1,000 warheads by the year 2030. Exceeding the pace and size the Defense Department projected in 2020. Beijing resisted President Trump's pressure last year to join nuclear arms control talks with Russia and the U.S. It claimed that its nuclear arsenal was far smaller and was only for defense purposes. On Thursday, federal agents arrested the primary researcher of the STEELE dossier, Russian analyst Igor Danchenko. A federal grand jury is charging him with 5 counts of lying to the FBI. This is part of Special Counsel John Durham's investigation on the origins of the FBI's probe of the 2016 Trump campaign. Danchenko was charged with misleading FBI officials about the sources of the information he provided to former British intelligence agent Christopher Steele. The STEELE dossier falsely claimed that Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign colluded with the Russian government, along with other misinformation that has turned out to be false. Republican Winsome Sears has become the first female lieutenant governor and the first black woman to win statewide office in Virginia. A former Marine, Sears had a brief stint in politics 20 years ago. She recently served as national chairperson for Black Americans to re-elect President Donald Trump. Half of the past 10 lieutenant governors in the state of Virginia have gone on to become governor. D.C.'s Mayor Muriel Bowser confirmed that she's running for re-election, officially seeking another 4 years in office. The D.C. mayor tweeted her plans to run, saying D.C. residents know how to rise to the challenge. During President Trump's term overlapping the pandemic, Mayor Bowser is most known for her backing of the Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C. The D.C. mayoral election will be held in November of 2022. She has been criticized for the surge in violent crime and the homelessness epidemic throughout the nation's capital. And that's all we have for you on the Capitol Report today. Thank you for tuning in. I'm your host, Steve Lance. I hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.